Our next guest helped former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson create TARP and the Bush administration's regulatory reform plan, their plan to stabilize the financial system. We welcome now David Nason, who's a managing director with Promontory Financial. Good morning to you. Thanks for joining us today. I want to ask you, we've heard from Treasury Secretary GEITHNER for the blanket statement. Yes, there are still challenges out there with the banking system, but he says loan delinquencies have peaked. This morning we heard from the head of TARP Oversight, Elizabeth Warren, that she says there are still real problems out there. Banks haven't digested their mortgage problems. What's real?
I think both are right. I think that it depends on your perspective. From GEITHNER's perspective, the banks are in a much better position than they were just a couple of years ago. From Elizabeth Warren's perspective, there's still some problems that need to be worked out. So there's no question that there are a lot of bad loans on banks that need to be worked through. There's no question that the banking sector still has some challenges to get through. So I think both are right and both are basically accurate.
Well, the premise for the regulatory reform that Congress is working on right now is that they were going to work out the kinks in the system that allowed for this problem to develop in the first place that led to the crisis. With the House and Senate negotiations going on right now to come up with sort of a final draft here, do you think that existing reg reform that's being discussed adequately addresses the issues that created the crisis?
I think it addresses a lot of the issues for the crisis. There's no question. I mean, there are a couple of things that the bill is going to do that's really important. The first is it's going to tighten regulation on the lending institutions, which is an important change that's happening. And secondly, it's going to look at and try to identify and manage systemic risk, which was one of the biggest problems of the crisis. So there's a lot of good things in the legislation that's going to come out of it. There's also a lot of uncertainty as to how this is all going to play out for the next 12 months.
You say there's a really just sort of status quo, though, when it comes to how the regulatory bodies are going to function.
Yeah, one thing I'm a bit disappointed about is we had an opportunity, I believe, to rationalize the structure of our regulatory agencies here in the United States, because I think most people believe that we probably have too many. We pretty much didn't do that in this regulatory reform bill. I think we've added a few regulators. We've reduced one and added a couple. So net, we're pretty much status quo in terms of the alphabet soup here in Washington, D.C.
But these are the people who are going to be enforcing the law that is being passed. So if you don't like the way that the regulators are going to be functioning, how can you like the legislation that's out there?
Well, there's two different things. There's the structure of the regulators, and then there's the way that the regulators are going to do their job. The way that the regulators are going to do their job is how they're directed to in the legislation. So the legislation does direct the regulators to increase capital standards for large banks, look at systemic risk, tighten regulation over OTC derivative contracts, and a whole host of other reforms that are largely positive and responsive to the crisis. So the structure issues, they didn't move in the direction that I would like to see. In terms of regulatory authority and the direction that Congress is pushing them, they've made some good progress.
All right. Well, a bit of a mixed report card, but you sound more positive than negative on this. Thank you for your perspective.